as a basic rule, you count the number of cores in a server. And this doesn't make a distinction yet between physical or virtual servers or server environments. You procure that number of cores per server with a minimum requirement of 4 cores per processor. SQL core licenses do not require client access licenses. Core licenses are acquired in 2 packs. So one license is always 2 cores. Standard edition can be licensed on a server cal basis. Even enterprise can still be licensed on a server cal basis, but only if you already bought the licenses way back when. If you're stepping into SQL licensing, you can only buy enterprise editions based on the per core model. So again, I have 3 examples here. If you look on the left side, there's a server with 2 processors and 4 cores per processor. You should assign 8 cores to this. If you look at the second server, you have 1 processor in a server with 4 cores. You assign, I think I made a mistake here, you assign 4 cores. And finally, you have a server with 4 processors with 6 cores per processor. You assign a minimum of 24 cores. So SQL has down edition rights, meaning if you're buying standard licenses, you can downgrade to any other edition that's lower than standard and any earlier version as well. So buying standard edition licenses, you can down edition to standard, work group, or small business. And with enterprise, you can down edition to any earlier version or edition of enterprise, meaning standard business intelligence 2014 or earlier, work group, small business, or even data center, which is an older version edition of SQL Server. For each SQL Server license with active software assurance, you have the right to use a failover server, passive until failover event. The number of cores for the failover server need to be equal or less than the active server. SQL Server licenses consist of components, and there's a typo here I see, but SQL Server license consists of components like reporting server and analysis server. You can separate and install components on different servers, but it doesn't take away any licensing requirements. So it means that if you separate the different components and install them on separate servers, you still need to license all the different cores with the amount of core licenses. And with SQL Server, with software assurance, you have license mobility across server farms, allowing you to move the license within a certain farm as often as needed. Now, as I said, there is some differences in the licensing based on what you can do with licensing on a physical level versus a virtual level. And in a virtualized environments, this can become quite complex. SQL is a platform application. There's no direct link to the hardware, like with Windows Server. So you can either assign your license to a physical layer, or you can assign your licenses to the virtual machines itself. And I have listed 3 of the most common models in which 3 of the most common scenarios that you might find with SQL Server. The first option is to license SQL Server Standard or Enterprise core licenses and just license the virtual cores. So if you do not do any heavy virtualization, but you want to run a certain amount of virtual machines with SQL, you just license the virtual cores, and then you count the minimum of 4 cores per virtual machine. And the second is to buy SQL Server Enterprise Edition core licenses. Then you can license all your physical cores, and it will allow you the right to run SQL Server in 1 VM per core that you required. So you can do either or. Or the most common scenario that you often find with larger organizations is buying SQL Server Enterprise core licenses with software assurance. And then you license all physical cores with software assurance, and it will grant you an extra software assurance benefit called unlimited virtualization right. In this case, you can license or use as many virtual machines as you want by just licensing software assurance on the physical layer. And this is used a lot to do, for instance, load balancing across an ESX cluster. Like I said, most large organizations will choose the third option. It's also the option that we encounter the most and where the biggest compliance risk is. So do this properly and don't skip any steps in defining the correct level of licensing requirements for your architecture. SQL Server has some special clauses. The SQL Server Enterprise incl model it's available. If you've bought enterprise server licenses in the past, you're still allowed to renew these. You can also trade these in. It's not something that Microsoft likes to talk about, but if you're still using SQL Server Enterprise in the server incl model, you can talk to Microsoft and make a trade. You trade in all your enterprise server and cal licenses, and you get core licenses in return. If you're using container technology, a container, as stated in the product terms, is considered a virtual operating system environment, and physical and virtual cores are considered hardware threads. As such, it's licensed according to the earlier rules I explained. When you acquire software assurance, there's a list of the additional rights that you're granted. Like I said on the previous slide, unlimited virtualization for enterprise core licenses, failover rights. There's an Azure Hybrid benefits for SQL as well. It works a bit differently than Windows Server. Do, again, check out the session that we have done on that on our YouTube page. You have license mobility and some additional things for enterprise core licenses. You can use the machine learning server for Windows, Linux, and Hadoop, and you have the option to use the Power BI report service. Finally, if you're using very old versions of SQL, you have the option, when you have software assurance, to buy extended security updates. Keep your environment secure and buy these updates if you are using these old versions.